Over the last few decades, African Americans have had a huge impact on many areas of society, such as politics, education, and most definitely athletics. When people think of African Americans in sports early on, Jackie Robinson is the first thing that comes to mind. However, it's unfortunate to know that someone as prolific as Althea Gibson herself is often overlooked. It's really sad to think that this is most likely the case due to the fact that she's a woman. When we look into her past, we're able to see positive advances that we've made in history. So let's take a look at one of the most powerful tennis champions of all time. Althea Neal Gibson was born on August 25th, 1927, in a city called Silver, South Carolina. Gibson at a young age moved with her family into a neighborhood in New York City called Harlem. At this time in her life, her family struggled financially and just overall had many hardships that made her childhood very difficult. Her family was on welfare and she was a client of Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Children. She also struggled in the classroom and most of the time she ended up skipping school completely. It can be assumed that this has resulted from the trauma she experienced at home, which also resulted in her running away from home numerous times. Did this stop her? No. She loved sports and this was her escape from her everyday life at home and school. One of the first sports she adopted was paddle, where she won many small tournaments playing until she was noticed by a famous musician named Buddy Walker, who invited her to play on the local tennis courts, knowing that she had the potential to be great. This is where she eventually found her passion for tennis to continue to grow. She played in small several tournaments hosted by the local recreation department. It's crazy to think that only after a year of playing, she had won many tournaments hosted by the ATA, also known as the American Tennis Association, an African American organization established to promote and sponsor tournaments for black players. She went on to eventually win back-to-back ATA-hosted tournaments in 1944 and 1945, but unfortunately fell short in 1946. Althea Gibson's competitive nature did not let that settle with her, and she ended up winning the next year in 1947 and won a continuation of a 9-year run until 1956. Not to mention that during this winning streak, she also made history as the first African-American tennis player to compete in the U.S. National Championships in 1950 and Wimbledon in 1951. As you can assume, at this time, tennis was a predominantly white-managed and segregated sport in the United States and the world all around it. But before all of her major success, the ATA was the only tournament hosted for black players because overall tennis, like I said, was predominantly white managed. These were the only two tournaments that allowed her to compete at the highest level that was within the African American rights at this time. Her bright future and past success in winning the ATA tournaments had allowed her to get the opportunity to attend Florida A&M University on a sports scholarship, which, as you know, school was not one of her strong suits. She struggled so badly at one point in time through college that she even considered dropping out, giving up tennis, and just enrolling in the military. Furthermore, segregation only added onto her frustration due to the fact that the tennis world was closed off. The turning point in all this was 1950 when the former number one in the world tennis player, Alice Marble, wrote an article in a magazine degrading the tennis community for denying a player of Althea Gibson's caliber to compete in some of the best tournaments in the world. Her article eventually caught wind, and 2 years later, Althea Gibson was allowed to repeat the Wimbledon, where she eventually became a top 10 player in the United States, and eventually her highest point was reaching number 7 in the world by 1953. Many people believe that it was her physique, standing at 5'11", she had the strength, power, and athletic ability to dominate the tennis scene, and it seemed as if she was bound for nothing less than success. In 1956, it all came together when Althea Gibson found her stride and won the French Open. Not much longer, she made a return to Wimbledon and attended the U.S. Open, where she left victorious in 1957 and 1958. To even add to more all that, while she was at Wimbledon, she not only won singles, she ended up winning doubles. Many people look at Althea Gibson as a huge inspiration to the sport of tennis, but being as humble as she was the only one who downplayed her role in the tennis community and quoted, "I have never regarded myself as a crusader." As she was the first African-American professional tennis player, Althea Gibson only continues her winning streak to show off her many titles, and in 1960, the most important thing of all was she was finally starting to earn money from playing sports, and getting advertisements at this point was extremely crucial because financially, she still wasn't where she needed to be, and she wasn't stable enough to support herself and her family. Although she won all these tournaments, none of them offered money, which made it extremely difficult for her to continue playing, which was predominantly the reason she had to stop playing tennis after all these years and all these victories. She financially just couldn't support herself anymore, and she had to try and find other ways and other means of doing this. Not only was she financially struggling, but she was also exhausted after facing so much adversity while playing a predominantly white sport. Oftentimes, fans would chant racial slurs while she was playing, which over time took its toll. One of the most interesting facts about everything about her is that she eventually started to pursue a career in golf, because she was also extremely talented at that as well. That is something that is also very much overlooked, as she had such a great success in the tennis community, but not only was she amazing at tennis, she ended up becoming one of the best African American golf players in the PGA Tour. But unfortunately, her success on the court did not transfer over to the course. After a short space of time in the golf world, she realized she was not having that much success. She ended up deciding to try and make her return to the tennis community. By this fact, the fans were amazed that she was going to make a return. It almost seemed too good to be true that this inspiration in the tennis world of the first African American professional was going to make a return. However, unfortunately, it was too good to be true. And by the time she returned in 1968, she became a little too old and a little too slow-footed to keep up with the younger tennis players. She continued fighting for 3 years until she fully retired once more in 1971, but then, luckily, was inducted into the International Tennis Hall of Fame. She later stayed connected to the sport overall, even if it wasn't fully related to tennis completely, and in 1974, 4 years later, after she retired, she ended up serving 10 years as a commissioner of the athletics in the state of New Jersey. Unfortunately, a few years after that, Althea Gibson's past came back to haunt her again, where she was becoming close to bankruptcy. Luckily, she was saved by one of the greatest tennis players of all times, the great Billie Jean King, and also a few other people stepped in to help her as well. When things looked like they had an opportunity of looking up again, her health began to take a decline, where she eventually suffered a stroke and started to develop serious heart problems. And on September 20th, 2003, Althea Gibson unfortunately died due to respiratory failure in East Orange, New Jersey. I find it truly inspirational and honestly beautiful that Althea Gibson overcame 2 types of segregation. Not only was it racism, but it was also the prejudice of being a woman at this time. She was one of the most significant African American athletes, not only our time and her time, but just of all time. And she paved the way for many African American athletes to this day to keep pushing through strength, grit, and perseverance in a time through segregation. She was one of the best African American tennis players currently. For example, players like Venus and Serena Williams, 2 of the greatest tennis players to ever play the sport, as well as Arthur Ashe, who was one of the best African American tennis players in history, even getting a stadium named after him.